The World Health Organization has declared that a new case of Ebola has not broken out in 42 days. That is the standard length of time to declare the end of an outbreak. It's twice the amount of time, 21 days, which is required to incubate Ebola. And this is really outstanding because Nigeria is one of the most populous countries in Africa. And it's home to Lagos, which is a very, very highly populated city. And it seems to be that they're in the clear right now. And that's due to some very careful planning and some very careful listening.
Yeah, it's been interesting throughout this experience to compare the experiences of these different countries. Obviously, like, they're all in Africa, but they have very, very different experiences with Ebola. They have very different levels of funding that can go into medical care and things like that. I mean, it's easy as Westerners to look at it and to say, it's all Africa, but there are huge differences. And as you pointed out, I mean, Lagos, very highly populated. Nigeria has like 160 to 170 million people. Very large country. If they hadn't been as careful as they were initially with it, it could have become a gigantic problem. And so it's all the more impressive that they were able to contain it.
I think a lot of people are looking at the response to Ebola in places like Nigeria, and they're comparing it to the CDC, and they're saying, look how ineffectual the CDC is. And I don't want to take anything away from the people who are saying, look how ineffectual the CDC is, because I think clearly there have been missteps. But I think that these countries, especially since Nigeria and much of Africa had to deal with an outbreak of Ebola 14 years ago, are ready because they know what to look for. They have the funding, they have the infrastructure, albeit much smaller and maybe less resources, but that's a thing that's on their radar, whereas in the United States, I don't think historically that we've had a lot of practice dealing clearly with Ebola.
A lot of it has to do with like rapid response to the first case and being able to quarantine someone, and they didn't necessarily shut down or I guess launch a scare campaign in terms of travel. It was more like, let's check everyone. Let's have everyone go through a checkpoint. We're not going to shut down travel, but we need to be thorough.
The most interesting stat that I think I've heard through the course of this whole thing is one of the head executives at the WHO said that 90% of the cost of outbreaks is due to ignorance. That it's not actually containing, it's not actually treating, it's people buying things they don't need to protect themselves, it's the economy being damaged by people not being willing to go to an area that it is safe to go to. And I think that this outbreak has been the clearest example of the damage of ignorance, because Ebola fundamentally is not an incredibly difficult disease to stop spreading because it's not airborne. You just have to stop direct contact with bodily fluids. But you see a lot of ignorance in America about how exactly you transfer Ebola, and that's been increased by the media being incredibly irresponsible in how they talk about it. And you saw early on in Africa, many people not trusting international aid agencies, feeling like they couldn't trust the hospitals, a lot of rage about areas being locked down. And so you saw things like places where Ebola was being treated being looted, and then the blankets being taken out and used and things like that. Like, if you can combat the ignorance, then you can combat the disease. And apparently Nigeria was just more effective at doing that.
It was a really rigorous education campaign. Like, we had religious leaders even telling people, this is what you need to do to be careful, and spreading that rather than what you said, let's scare everybody into buying these things and panicking and doing things that are ultimately harmful.
I think the other thing is that they don't have an election coming up in a couple of weeks, and there's a lot, I think, that goes on in the United States, with the sort of Ebola craze, the crisis that is tied back on both sides to people sort of trying to profiteer from the fact that we're all sort of a little bit on edge. I think it doesn't really make sense for Africa to freak out the same way that it does for the United States to freak out. Also, though, 19 infected in Lagos, 12 survived, many of whom died were healthcare workers. The United States, out of 300 million people, we've only had 3, one of whom has died. We'll see clearly how the spread happens in the United States, but we can say that the Ebola has been stopped in Nigeria, but they're not out of the woods yet.
No,
it's still possible.
I mean, they still
that
have to move forward, and they still have to be very vigilant about maintaining, the amount of resources, the response, the screening, all of that. It's not over. Hell no, it's not over. But it seems like officials in Nigeria and also Senegal are being very vigilant on that, and I think that's something we can learn from. Don't panic and freak out, and be open to making these changes.
Yeah, I wonder, I don't know the exact numbers, but there's the different types of bodily fluids can maintain a level of the disease that can infect someone for different amounts of time. And I read that semen is one of the longest. Like, it's more than 2 months after you've survived the disease, you can still infect someone with semen. So I hope that they're providing check the numbers. I'm not a doctor, but I hope that they're, like, for the people who survived it, that they're being incredibly vigilant. I'm sure that they are. And the thing that worries me, though, is I think that you're right. Obviously, this is, in America, this is being led by fears over the election, is leading to fears over Ebola. And what I'm worried is that after we get past the election, when ISIS doesn't seem as scary and immigrants don't seem as scary, and especially Ebola doesn't seem as scary, that there might be a draining of the will to help internationally in the fight against Ebola if it gets to Europe, but especially in Africa now, when I think that we do still have a part to play, if not in education, which we failed on, at least in funding, and that funding might dissipate after the election.
Well, I think you see with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, there are precedents that are set in place to continue to help to try and combat this and other diseases.
How do you feel about the U.S. military response? I mean, do you think that will dissipate?
I feel like Obama might well have been influenced by election concerns and sending that over, but I honestly, I don't think that this is just political bias when I say that. I don't think he's being affected in the same way that those who are trying to take out the Democrats are being affected.
He doesn't have that same kind of need, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and the danger with our situation with Ebola, I think, stems back to the hysteria really clouding any kind of education. And I think that the biggest risk that we have is allowing the hysteria to really take over and for us to forget about the actual transmission of Ebola and the way that it can spread. And by that sort of crisis and sort of hysteria lead us to a place where there is more actual spread of Ebola.
Well, who would have known? Ignorance is the key to not handling Ebola well. Nigeria is doing well, and so is Senegal. It's not over yet, so they're going to keep continuing with the vigilance as Ebola continues to be a problem in other African nations. Let us know what you think below in the comments about this, and please be sure to subscribe.